John Dillinger. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, when Americans were losing faith in banks that had stolen their savings, one man became a folk hero by robbing those same institutions. John Dillinger grew up in Indianapolis and turned to crime after a botched grocery store robbery landed him in prison for 9 years, where he learned advanced techniques from experienced criminals. After his release in 1933, Dillinger assembled a crew and embarked on a year-long bank robbery spree across the Midwest, hitting over a dozen banks and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. He became famous for his daring escapes, once breaking out of an Indiana jail using a wooden gun he had carved and painted to look real, fooling guards and locking them in his cell. Dillinger was named Public Enemy Number 1 by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, making him the first person to ever receive that designation and turning the pursuit into a national obsession. The FBI tracked him relentlessly, and in July 1934, they received a tip from Ana Kumpanash, a Romanian immigrant known as the Lady in Red, who betrayed his location. Dillinger was gunned down outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago after watching the film Manhattan Melodrama, ending his criminal career at just 31 years old. Bonnie and Clyde. Small-town Texas during the Great Depression produced one of America's most infamous criminal couples when Bonnie Parker, a waitress and aspiring poet, met Clyde Barrow, a petty thief, in 1930. The pair began their crime spree in 1932, robbing small stores, rural gas stations, and banks across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana, with various gang members joining them along the way. Unlike the romanticized versions shown in movies, Bonnie and Clyde were brutal criminals who killed at least 9 police officers and several civilians during their 2-year run. Clyde preferred to rob small-town banks and stores rather than major institutions because they had less security and allowed for quicker getaways in the stolen Ford V8 cars he favored for their speed. Bonnie Parker wrote poetry during their time on the run, including The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, which she sent to newspapers and helped create their legend as romantic outlaws, though the poem actually predicted their violent deaths. The gang's crimes attracted massive law enforcement attention, and in May 1934, former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer set up an ambush on a rural Louisiana road. Officers fired over 130 rounds into their car, killing both Bonnie and Clyde instantly, with their bullet-riddled bodies becoming a gruesome spectacle as crowds gathered at the scene. Pretty Boy Floyd. Oklahoma farmland during the Dust Bowl era shaped Charles Arthur Floyd into one of the Depression's most notorious bank robbers. His reputation rivaled John Dillinger himself during this period. Floyd got his nickname Pretty Boy, either from a prostitute who called him that or from a Kansas City crime boss, depending on which story you believe. He reportedly hated the name. He began his criminal career with small-time robberies before graduating to banks across the Midwest. Floyd became skilled at fast getaways and evading police through back roads he knew from his Oklahoma upbringing. He robbed dozens of banks between 1929 and 1934, often targeting institutions that were foreclosing on farms. This made him a folk hero to struggling rural families who saw him as fighting against the banks that ruined them. During his robberies, Floyd reportedly destroyed mortgage documents when he found them, freeing farmers from their debts. Though historians debate whether this actually happened or became part of his manufactured legend, the FBI connected him to the Kansas City Massacre of 1933, where 4 law enforcement officers and a criminal prisoner were killed. Floyd always denied involvement. In October 1934, FBI agents and local police tracked him to a farm in Ohio. He was shot and killed while trying to flee across a cornfield, reportedly dying with his hands up. Barker Karpis Gang. In the early 1930s, Alvin Creepy Karpis teamed up with the Barker brothers, Fred and Arthur, under the watchful eye of their mother, Kate Ma Barker. Unlike other gangs that focused solely on bank robberies, this crew pioneered the criminal enterprise of kidnapping wealthy businessmen for ransom. They made hundreds of thousands of dollars from terrified victims. The gang's most profitable kidnapping occurred in 1933 when they abducted William Ham Jr., a Minnesota Brewing Company president. They collected $100,000 for his safe return. They followed this success by kidnapping banker Edward Bremer in 1934, demanding $200,000, which was one of the highest ransoms paid during that era. Ma Barker became famous as the supposed mastermind behind the gang's operations. However, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover likely exaggerated exaggerated her role to justify killing an elderly woman during a shootout. Alvin Karpis later claimed she was just a helpless old woman who had no leadership role whatsoever. The FBI hunted the gang relentlessly. They killed Fred Barker and Ma Barker in a Florida shootout in January 1935 after a 4-hour gun battle. Alvin Karpis continued on the run until 1936, when he was personally arrested by J. Edgar Hoover in New Orleans, becoming the last public enemy #1 to be captured. Willie Sutton. New York City's streets produced one of the most prolific bank robbers in American history when Willie Sutton began his criminal career in the 1920s. He eventually robbed an estimated 100 banks over 4 decades. Sutton earned the nickname The Actor because he used elaborate disguises during his heists. He dressed as a mailman, police officer, maintenance worker, or messenger to gain access to banks without raising suspicion. His approach differed from violent gangsters of his era because he preferred using his intelligence and charm rather than guns. He carried weapons to intimidate bank employees, though. Between 1926 and 1952, Sutton stole approximately $2 million from banks across the Northeast, and this made him one of the FBI's most wanted criminals throughout multiple decades. When a reporter supposedly asked Sutton why he robbed banks, he allegedly replied, "Because that's where the money is," creating the famous Sutton's Law, though he later claimed in his autobiography that he never actually said this, and a reporter made it up. Sutton also became famous for his prison escapes. He broke out of 3 different high-security facilities, including using a ladder made in the prison workshop to scale the walls of Eastern State Penitentiary. He was finally captured in 1952 after a citizen recognized him on a New York subway. He spent the rest of his sentence in Attica, where he was eventually released in 1969. The Newton Boys. Rural Texas farmland in the early 1900s produced 4 brothers who would become the most successful bank and train robbers of their era, though their names remain relatively unknown compared to flashier criminals. Willis, Jess, Joe, and Doc Newton grew up in poverty and turned to robbing banks across the Midwest and South between 1919 and 1924, using carefully planned operations rather than violence. The brothers developed a systematic approach, studying banks for weeks before hitting them at night when they were closed, using nitroglycerin to blow open safes without confronting anyone. Willis Newton, the eldest brother, masterminded their operations and claimed they robbed over 80 banks during their 5-year spree, making them potentially the most prolific bank robbery crew in American history. The Newton Boys pulled off what was then the largest train robbery in U.S. history in 1924, stealing over $3 million from a mail train outside Chicago, though they were quickly caught when one brother got drunk and talked too much at a party. After their release, the brothers went legitimate, with Willis living until 1979 and giving interviews about their criminal past, even consulting on a 1998 film about their exploits. Brinks Job Crew. Boston's North End neighborhood became the setting for what was called the crime of the century when 11 men executed a meticulously planned robbery on January 17, 1950. The crew, led by Anthony Fats Pino and Joseph Big Joe McGinnis, spent over a year surveilling the Brinks building, studying security routines, testing locks, and even making duplicate keys to enter the facility. On the night of the heist, the robbers wore identical Halloween masks, resembling Captain Marvel characters and Navy peacoats, entering the building and subduing employees in the counting room without firing a single shot. The crew escaped with over $2.7 million in cash, checks, and securities, which would be worth approximately $30 million today, making it the largest robbery in American history at that time. The thieves were so confident they had committed the perfect crime that they agreed not to touch the money for 6 years, waiting until the statute of limitations expired. But their plan fell apart when one member became paranoid and started talking. The FBI investigated the case for 6 years until Joseph Specs O'Keefe, a crew member who felt cheated out of his share, agreed to testify against the others. In 1956, just days before the statute of limitations would have expired, 8 members were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Lufthansa Heist Crew. New York's Kennedy Airport became the target of America's largest cash robbery on December 11, 1978. A crew connected to the Lucchese crime family hit the Lufthansa Airlines cargo terminal in a perfectly executed operation. James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke masterminded the heist after receiving inside information from Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo worker drowning in gambling debts. Werner revealed the facility's security weaknesses and vault schedules to the crew. 6 masked gunmen stormed the cargo building early in the morning. gang. They held employees at gunpoint while loading over $6 million in cash and jewelry onto a van in just 64 minutes. Burke had planned the robbery expecting around $2 million. The crew was shocked to discover they had stolen 3 times their estimate in untraceable bills being shipped from Europe. The heist became famous not just for the money stolen, but because almost everyone involved ended up dead. Jimmy Burke systematically murdered crew members and associates to eliminate witnesses and avoid sharing the profits. The robbery later inspired the film Goodfellas decades later. Within months, bodies started appearing across New York. Tommy DeSimone was killed by the Gambino family for an unrelated murder. Dozens of others connected to the heist also disappeared. Louis Werner was the only person ever convicted for the Lufthansa heist. He received 15 years in prison. Jimmy Burke died in prison in 1996 without ever being charged for the robbery itself. No Name Gang. Boston's Charlestown neighborhood during the 1980s and 1990s became home to one of the most dangerous armored car robbery crews in American history. Authorities simply called them the No Name Gang because they operated with such secrecy. Anthony Shea led this tight-knit group of Charlestown natives who specialized in hitting armored cars and banks across New England. They used military-style planning and violence to execute their heists. The crew earned their mysterious nickname because members maintained such strict silence about their operations. Police couldn't identify them for years, despite knowing robberies were being committed by the same group. Charlestown had a reputation as the bank robbery capital of America during this period. The neighborhood produced more armored car robbers per capita than anywhere else in the country. During one 1991 robbery in New Hampshire, one crew member named Michael O'Halloran shot and killed armored car guard Robert Morrissey. Years later, investigators discovered the gang had buried $100,000 from the heist in a backyard, which they never retrieved. Federal authorities finally dismantled the crew in the early 2000s. Anthony Shea received a life sentence for his role in multiple robberies and the murder. North Hollywood bank robbers. A quiet Friday morning in Los Angeles turned into a war zone on February 28, 1997, when 2 heavily armed men walked into a Bank of America branch in North Hollywood. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu entered the bank wearing full body armor and carrying illegally modified automatic weapons. Prepared for a military-style operation, the robbers took their time inside, spending nearly 20 minutes collecting money while knowing police were already outside, showing complete confidence in their equipment and firepower. When they finally emerged, they opened fire on the dozens of police officers surrounding the building, sparking a 44-minute shootout that was broadcast live on television across the country. The officers' standard pistols and shotguns couldn't penetrate the robbers' body armor, forcing police to get rifles from a nearby gun store to match the criminals' firepower, which changed police equipment standards nationwide afterward. Both robbers were eventually killed, Phillips by a self-inflicted gunshot and Matasareanu from blood loss after being shot in unprotected areas. The incident left 12 police officers and 8 civilians injured and led to police departments across America upgrading their weapons and tactical equipment.